Hi, this is Joel Duff. Welcome back to my channel, and today, episode number 3 of the mailbox. This is where I take a look at questions that arrive either through my email or through chat or through some other source. And interested parties who may have watched my videos or regular viewers of mine have additional questions. And I pick out a few of those and try to answer those questions. And today we have an email that I received recently that I realized when I began to write a response, it was going to take me a long time to write it, and it might just be better if I just talked through my particular answer. And I thought, well, it's time to make another mailbox episode out of this. So here I am, just off the top of my head mostly, responding to the question, what is the best evidence for common ancestry? Now, in order to talk about common ancestry, we're also going to need to maybe contrast and compare another concept called common design that's often held up against the idea of common ancestry. So we're going to talk about those two things, and who knows where things will go since I don't really have a script for this. So we've got that and whatever else comes up off the top of my head coming up. So here's the question we're going to be addressing, well, at least part of this question. I saw your review on the book Traced on YouTube, and I enjoyed it, and I wanted to ask you a question. What is the best evidence for common descent, and how would you reconcile common descent with the story of Adam and Eve in Scripture? I found the below article from Biologos, but I was wondering if you would add or nuance anything. So to my follower who wrote this question to me, thank you very much. I think it's a very good question. And in a way, I don't have any particular canned answer to either of these questions, which you might think I would have. They're two very important questions, and I've actually addressed both of them in a variety of different ways, both here on my YouTube channel and more extensively on my blog. Now, if you may be a little disappointed, but I will write the individual who wrote me later and give him some of my perspective on the portion of his question about Adam and Eve and common descent, although I'm going to touch on that a little bit as we move along, or maybe more than a little bit, depending on how things go here. But I'm mostly going to be asking the question, what is the evidence for common ancestry? Now, he uses the word common descent in the question, but I'll probably be using the word common ancestry most of the time, just because that's just the words that I am more used to saying more frequently. So I'll just say common ancestry for common descent. I think we need to start by saying, or I will say, that there isn't a single sort of gotcha piece of data. There isn't that one single thing. When people ask, what is the best data? I've never had an answer that said, like, here's the one thing that you would look at, and this will convince you. No, it's more of, it's like a lot of theories, right? It's a preponderance of data from maybe multiple sources that all then point to a single explanation that best fits all of that particular data. There are some particularly powerful pieces of data that would seem to be most easily interpreted within a common ancestry context or under the hypothesis of common ancestry versus other hypotheses or explanations for that particular data. And so we can point to some of those, and I certainly am going to point to a few pieces of evidence that people have claimed is good evidence for common ancestry. But I don't ever find that there's going to be like one data point that you can show anybody and change their mind or convince them of something, nor do I think you should be convinced by one single data point. So the simplest thing, maybe to start out, is to first start by saying everybody believes in common ancestry to some extent. Now, the question that came to me said, what's the best evidence for common descent? But I think what the person who's asking it is probably more specifically asking about universal common descent. So we need to make that distinction. Most people that are maybe resistant to the idea of common ancestry are actually resistant to the idea of universal common ancestry, that there's like one common ancestor of all living things, as opposed to there is ancestry of individuals, and they may share an ancestry because everybody accepts that there is common ancestry. The question is, how much common ancestry is there? So for example, I share a common ancestor with my siblings, and I share a common ancestor with my cousins. That ancestor is a little more distant. All right, it's not as close to me as the ancestor along with my sisters. And then I also share an ancestor with my second and third cousins, and I share an ancestor with my 100th cousin. Right. And I don't think there's nothing controversial about me saying that, right? We all accept that there is common ancestry of, say, really all people living on Earth share common ancestry, in that there is somebody that is that we have a common ancestor that's shared among all of us. And so there is common ancestry. That's undeniable. Although at the end of this, I'm gonna hold off. We'll kind of push this to the absurd end and ask ourselves, how can we even really know about that ancestry? Could that actually be common design and not common ancestry? And so that's what we need to get to, is this idea of common design, common ancestry, in order to start to tease out what some of the differences are and what we would look for in order to even identify what might be the result of common design versus common ancestry. All right, so to do that, I'm going to go first to that Biologos paper that was referred to by the person that asked me the question. They said they had read this Biologos paper, and they wondered if there's anything I could add to that or nuance that. And I think that there is. And let's just go there now. And so here we are. This is the Biologos article, Common Descent versus Common Design. 4 examples explained better by descent, in which Jim Stump, who's writing here in 2021, is giving 4 examples of data that is most easily interpreted within the context of a hypothesis of common descent versus common design. And so we have to begin first by defining what common descent and common design is, so that we can use these terms more, in their best possible way. So we better begin by defining common descent and common design, and Jim Stump does that for us very helpfully. And so I'm going to read these definitions that he has, or explanations of these two, so that we can keep those two things in mind as we're talking about some examples and sort of ways that we would identify design versus descent. Common descent, the common descent explanation. The evidence we see of shared characteristics in plants and animals alive today and in the fossil record is best explained by supposing that they descended from common ancestors. That's the common descent explanation, that the evidence we see of shared characteristics is that they are shared because their common ancestor or their common relative had that particular feature and shared that characteristic with them. Common design explanation is that some evidence can be explained equally well by supposing a designer created species or kinds separately. That is to say, they don't have common ancestry because God, or some intelligent designer, but I'm going to say God, the God of the Hebrew Bible, designed organisms in his mind and then created those. But in that design process, has the appearance of their having ancestry, right? Because they used a common design template for those characteristics which are similar. So for example, mammals have certain similar characteristics, and the explanation for common design is that they share those common characteristics because God had in his mind a model of a general mammal, in which he took those basic characteristics that unify all mammals, but then when created different kinds of mammals, added certain characteristics or properties to those individual groups of mammals that gave them unique properties, such that they share characteristics, but they also share dissimilarities between them. And thus, that is where the diversity of life is observed in this case. All right, so the key thing here is going to be, is there evidence, are there observations in the world around us for which one of these explanations of the diversity that we see, of the characteristics and features of organisms that we see, works better or explains better the data. That's very poorly put, but we move on. And before I wander off in some of my own thoughts on this topic and give some examples, I want to bring to your attention this particular article. Nothing in biology makes sense except in the light of evolution. And many people who, they don't have to be an evolutionary biologist to possibly be familiar with this particular line. And you may have heard this particular expression and always wondered what it means or where it comes from. It comes from a paper with that title by Theodosius Dobzhansky. Theodosius Dobzhansky was an eminent geneticist and evolutionary biologist who immigrated from Russia early in the 20th century and went on to make many discoveries in genetics. And toward the end of his life, he wrote a number of articles, sort of reflections upon things he learned. And in this case, he was particularly asked by the American biology teacher, which is the journal that he's publishing in here. And I think he's 90 some years old when he wrote this paper. And he was asked to sort of like, hey, for biology teachers, could you just sort of sum up, what it is about, what is this thing, evolutionary biology, and why should that be taken seriously? What is the evidence for evolution sort of writ large? And so he took it upon himself to write essentially what is an essay. And that essay explains sort of the big ideas of what evidence people have seen in the world around them that have made them think that organisms may have changed over time. All right, and by certain mechanisms. And what is the evidence that organisms have changed over time and by particular mechanisms, particularly, of course, Darwin's ideas of natural selection, but Dobzhansky and others had added very much to Darwin by this time writing this article. And I also want to point out that his article is the title of this article, In the Light of Evolution, actually harkens back to another statement made by a priest, scientist, writer, philosopher, Pierre de Chagin, and I'm going to butcher that name, it's French, who is well known for his writings on evolution and philosophy and so forth. And he had used this phrase, evolution is a light which illuminates all facts. And so that's actually one of the basis of this particular phrase that Dobzhansky uses that many people hear. But you may be surprised as to the content of this particular paper. I'm going to put a link to this paper below this presentation. And I really encourage you to read this paper. I give this paper to one of my classes as sort of a discussion starter, and it's a really fantastic discussion starter just to get students talking about evidence, to talk about ideas, and to actually argue with one another, although we very much emphasize productive argument in class. But it gets them thinking on the topic of evolution, what evidence is there. And what's especially interesting, I think, about this paper is it's written in 1973. And so Dobzhansky doesn't even really have a firm grasp of what I think most molecular and evolutionary biologists would say today, which is what is the best evidence for common descent or common ancestry. It comes from molecular biology. And Dobzhansky actually includes a little bit of molecular biology in here and on proteins. But his arguments are very much from morphology and other things that he sees as being evidence of common ancestry. And so I'm not going to go through this whole article, like I said, but I think it would be very valuable to read this particular article and think about its historical context and then compare that to the things I'm going to say about sort of molecular biology on top of that. But let me just give you a couple little short quotes from this paper that are things that I emphasize in some of my classes. And I'm not talking just about evolutionary biology, but ways of thinking about biology. So he begins after an introduction, which is a very fascinating way of entering into this discussion because he himself is an Eastern Orthodox Christian. And so he he is addressing some of the controversies over evolution. At the same time, he's talking about this evidence for evolutionary theory. And I'm not going to read this paper, but I do think it's very, as I said before, I think it's an important thing. I think it's an important historical paper to read. And his approach is kind of fascinating and probably unexpected when you read it. I'll just tell you, it's probably not what you're going to expect to see and read. And when my students read this paper, they're also confronted with things they probably never thought that they would read in class, and have to think through some things that they never have thought about before. But what I want to do here is just bring out a couple observations that Dobzhansky makes about the world. These don't just apply to evolutionary thought, but these are just good thoughts to think about in terms of how to understand biology. So he begins by talking about the diversity of living things, but also the unity of life. And so he's contrasting these two things. He said the diversity and the unity of life are equally striking and meaningful aspects of the living world. Right? When we look around the world, we see incredible diversity around us. And so he has this whole section here where he's just talking about just amazing diversity. Species that do extremely specific things and maybe live in very specific locations versus generalist organisms. And so I think we all have some appreciation, although probably not a full appreciation, for the total diversity of life on this earth. Even as a biologist, I have to say I'm constantly surprised by the overall diversity of life. And then he has another section, though, in which he's talking about the unity of life. So despite all living, there's being so much diversity, not just in the shapes and features of organisms or the morphology, but now we know also in the biochemistry and the genetics of organisms, there's a tremendous amount of diversity. At the same time, that's a reality of this world that needs to be explained. And that's one thing that's a challenge to all biologists, all interested human beings, is where does that diversity come from? What is the origin of that diversity? How is that diversity maintained? How does it continue to interact with the world around us and maybe change over time? How does that diversity change? All right, those are really fundamental questions in biology. At the same time, those are good and interesting questions. There's another question, and that is, why is there such unity of life? So then he goes through and he breaks down, here's a bunch of characteristics that all living things share. And not all of them are intuitive. They kind of raise the question, why? Why would all organisms have these particular features? And to get back to our design thing, the question raised becomes, why would a designer not have made more diverse basic types of organisms? Why are they all based on a fundamental pattern, a fundamental biochemistry that all organisms share? And so any meaningful explanation for the diversity of life, for life itself and the various forms it takes on, has to answer the question, how is there diversity, but also unity of life at the same time? That's the challenge to any model that's trying to explain life on Earth. Have to explain how you got diversity and unity among those organisms at the same time. And one thing that evolutionary biology does in a very powerful way is demonstrate how you can get unity among organisms, why you have common features, but why you also have diversity at the same time. And that's one of the things that has been said to be one of the most powerful features of evolutionary theory, is its ability to explain both of these observations of the world around us. All right, I'm saying a lot there, but it's going to build up to some other things that we're going to get to. One other quote from this. So as he's talking about unity, I got a little ahead of myself. The unity of life is no less remarkable than the diversity. Most forms of life are similar in many aspects. The universal biological similarities are particularly striking in the biochemical dimension. From viruses to man, heredity is coded in just two chemically related substances, DNA and RNA. The genetic code is as simple as it is universal. There are only 4 genetic letters in DNA, the A, G, T's, and C's, and uracil replaces thymine and RNA. And then the entire evolutionary development of the living world has taken place not by invention of new letters in the genetic alphabet, but by the elaboration of ever new combinations of these letters. That's what we observe. Rather than having different chemistry in different organisms, we have the same chemistry, we just have a different elaboration of the order or the sequence of the letters of the alphabet that then spell out different combinations. Now, he goes on to say, not only is DNA, RNA genetic code universal, but so is the method of translation of the sequences of the letters into the sequences of the amino acids, the proteins, right? You have 20 amino acids and they compose many different proteins. Now, he's referring to a universal genetic code here. There's one code that all living things use as being one of the things that unifies all living things. The same, I'm going to show this later on a table. So in case you're not getting this, I'm going to go through this in a little more detail because this is an important point here. The DNA and RNA of the genetic code, or the universal code, I'm going to show you that's not exactly universal. So this is 1973. He's unaware of the exceptions to the rule. And so the fact that there are exceptions to the rule raises some really interesting questions about how that fits with the idea of which explains the exceptions better. Common design or common ancestry or common descent. Okay, I'm rambling a lot, and I don't feel like that's a productive way to go much further. So if you don't get my point about the genetic code and the alternative genetic code and some of the challenges that creates, then that's okay. Let's just try another way of thinking about this. And so let's go back to what I originally said about everybody believes in common design. So this is actually a road I would probably go. I hadn't really thought about this until I started thinking about talking about this. Like, what would be my angle? How would I sort of step through thinking about common design, common ancestry? And I'm already pretty unhappy with the direction I already went with the genetic code. All right. Sometimes molecular examples sound really powerful, and because molecular biologists might know a lot of the background, and it's really hard to communicate those aspects. So let's try a different train of thought. So I have an Old English sheepdog. All right. And it shares a common ancestor with other sheepdogs. But does anyone doubt that my Old English sheepdog, which has very specific features of its breed, shares some ancestry with other Old English sheepdogs that also have the same characteristics? Well, what makes those characteristics? The characteristics are determined by its genetics, right? It has a suite of genes, and really almost all those genes it has in common with other dogs, other domesticated dogs. The difference between my sheepdog's genes and other domesticated dogs' genes are different alleles, different variations of those particular genes. And as two different sheepdogs that have the same characteristics, same behaviors, same shapes and sizes, right? All those things. They probably share almost all of the same variants at those particular genes. And so their genomes are very similar. We could say like they're 99.99% similar at the DNA nucleotide level. And then at the variant level, they're also very similar to one another and so forth. Right? And so what am I really doing here? I'm making an argument for common design. For common descent. Right? And I'm saying, why do I believe that my sheepdog has an ancestor that's also a sheepdog and that it shares ancestry with other sheepdogs? Why do I believe that? I could believe it because of like eyewitness reports. Like, hey, there's this breeder out there and my dog came from that breeder. They also had this other sheepdog and I can see that other sheepdog, 10 miles away, and their sheepdog and my sheepdog is very similar. And I know they actually share an actual ancestor, right? That is, seems like proof that they share common ancestry. And the differences between them are due to descent, all right, with modification. They may have made a few mistakes as they copied from parent to offspring, and the two offspring got maybe different variants as a result. And so that's the idea of, we're not really going to add that on, but common descent with modification, which is changes over time. Right, so this isn't surprising anybody. Like, that's common ancestry. And you're like, okay, yeah, I believe in common ancestry. Right? There is definitely common ancestry. It exists in this world. All right, well, what about my sheepdogs? Are they related to, by common ancestry, to other dogs? So Great Danes. Do they share a common ancestor with Great Danes? And I think that everyone would agree that they share an ancestor with Great Danes. Now, what if you want to dispute that? Right? You said, there's no witness. I don't know of any witness that's actually seen the original ancestor that gave rise to a lineage, separate lineages that became sheepdogs, Old English sheepdogs, and Great Danes. Right? That is lost to history. I can't see that. I don't have any reports of it. Now, how are you going to convince me that they have common ancestry? Oh, okay. They share a whole bunch of features, right? They're domesticated dogs. They share a tremendous number of morphological features. Their anatomy is very similar. Their genetics are really similar. I mean, yes, they have a few differences because they look a little different. But overall, they're still 99.999% similar in for many, many different features that you might want to measure. And you might look at that and say, well, they have the same genes, and the genes are in the same order in the genome, and blah, 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 right? You just list off a whole bunch of things. And you might even look back and say, oh, I can look back in history and I can see Old English sheepdogs, Old English sheepdogs, Old English sheepdogs, and I can see Great Dane, Great Dane, Great Dane, Great Dane. But then when you get somewhere back in history, you kind of like, Great Danes aren't exactly like Great Danes today, and Old English sheepdogs aren't exactly like sheepdogs today because they were mated with something else that then got the features that they have now. And I can see how they've kind of changed in the past. And so I see a pattern of Old English sheepdogs and Great Danes, which if I look farther back in history, they actually become somewhat more similar to other. I can imagine they have a shared like litter, mates, right? Somewhere back in time. What are you doing there? You're actually making an argument from the fossil record in a way, aren't you? You're saying I'm looking back in history, just like I look at fossils, and I see their changes over time, and I'm inferring, even though I didn't see it, right, with my own eyes, I'm inferring logically, and I think appropriately. Like, this is not radical logic at all. This is not inappropriate inference. You're inferring based on the things you know about genetics, about history, about fossils, about that they share a common ancestor. And it's not hard for me to convince you that really almost all domesticated dogs share ancestry with one another. All right, great. So they share ancestry. What about common design? What if you had never seen, like, all of that was inference. You did not actually see the actual string of events and see that original dog that was the ancestor to an Old English sheepdog and to Great Danes. In fact, you haven't even seen the ancestor of all Old English sheepdogs. So how do you know that there is an ancestor to all Old English sheepdogs? Do you really know that? You're probably not doubting it. However, if you're not doubting it, you're believing in common ancestry based on inferences, basing on saying, this is the simplest explanation for the observations that I'm making. It makes sense. Now let's flip that around and say, what about common design? Could you come along and say, you know what, Great Danes and sheepdogs were made separately. They don't have any relationship to each other. They don't have a common ancestor. They were commonly designed, right? God had in his mind sheepdog and used a template that's very similar to other domesticated dogs. So maybe there's a domesticated dog template or like operating system, and then but made individual characteristics that make the different breeds and simply started those breeds at some point. How would you know that that didn't happen? Now, I know that there are some things that say designists would go to in order to get out of this problem. Because you see what I'm doing, of course. I'm saying, the two different explanations both could work. But at some points, people completely dismiss the common design. Even people that are devoted to design will dismiss the design argument because they think the other argument is better, right? There's a preponderance of evidence that the other argument is better. So what is the preponderance of evidence in this case? In this case, it is, there's like a negative evidence against the design, right? And the negative evidence I think that most Christians would draw upon would they be say, for one thing, I can see that they potentially can mate with each other. That suggests that they have some commonality of features that are close enough that they can integrate with one another. And therefore, if they can actually procreate together, that in my particular understanding of what a kind is that God made fits within a particular kind, right? Because they're all part of that original creation of that one kind. And so therefore they're all, I'm looking for the word here, they're all compatible with each other. I don't think that really gets you completely out of the design argument, right? Because he could have just started with a same kind of like my argument with the universal genetic code and the exceptions. He could have started with the argument that, God made domesticated dogs and had a template for those, but created like 10 different kinds of domesticated dogs, each with their own varieties, but made them compatible with each other because they're in the same kind, right? And made them compatible with each other. He designed them to be compatible. So now the other thing that I think people will say is we see evidence that domesticated dogs, specifically like Old English sheepdogs, haven't existed for more than a couple hundred years. And if they haven't existed for a couple hundred years, God's not creating new things after creation. So this would be like, I think their most powerful argument from their perspective is they would say like, God finished creation at the end of 6 days. He's not creating new kinds or new things. So he's not actually designing right now, right? Not designing new things right now and creating them. Like there's a new thing right there with a new design. And although we won't go into the progressive creationist world of old earth creationism, progressionism, because there is kind of that sense of God's constantly designing. But even that, there's a seventh day and a cessation, and okay, it gets really tricky. Let's just stick with common design, common ancestry. All right, so now you've got that dog. So I'm saying they could say that creation ended on the 6th day, and Old English sheepdogs appear later. So therefore, because they appear later, they must have come from some ancestor that existed since the creation. And then they would just point to other dogs. They would say like those dogs came first, and then that then gave rise to Old English sheepdogs. So therefore, common ancestry. Right? It's not common design. It's common ancestry that explains Old English sheepdogs. They are evolved or changed, adapted from some original creation that was the original design. See, sheepdogs aren't the original design. They are something that's after the original design, which is descent by modification from the original design. All right, so change over time. All right, well, let's push this a little farther. So you're saying, okay, right, we don't need common design to explain dog breeds. We're fine with common ancestry. They have ancestry. There's a common ancestor to all domesticated dogs. What's the common ancestor? Okay, you're like wolves, right? All domesticated dogs come from wolves. And there's disputes about whether there's like multiple different origins of domesticated dogs or whether there's a single time that domesticated dogs came from a wolf pack. And so all domesticated dogs are related to each other. That would really be common descent from a common ancestor. Irregardless, I think if this is still going to work. This is still a challenging question here. Did God create domesticated dogs? I think most young earth creationists would say no. I think most intelligent designists would say no. Domesticated dogs were not designed exactly as they are. It would say they were wolves at one time, right? They share a common ancestor with wolves. There were wolves around, and those wolves gave rise to through common ancestry, common descent to what we see today, which are domesticated dogs. Through what mechanisms? Well, having offspring, okay, replicating, making mistakes while replicating, so creating new variations, also rearrangements of the original genome, creating new combinations, and then you have natural selection working on combinations to create combinations that are pleasing to in different environments. And actually, it's not so much natural selection as artificial selection. It's us selecting, I want Old English Sheepdog characteristics, and I am purposely picking out those particular characteristics. Let's go back to the wolf. You know where this is going, right? You know where this is going. If the wolf and domesticated dogs are related to one another, what does that mean? It means they share a common ancestor, right? It means there's common descent between the two of them. Now, does that mean that an intelligent designer made wolves? Is that the original organism that God made and had the design of? Did he design the wolf genome? And then from there are all modern wolves, which have a lot of variation themselves now, and domesticated dogs. And you're probably sitting there thinking, no. All right? Because even young earth creationists don't say yes to what I just said. They'll say, actually, wolves are very similar to coyotes. And they can interbreed with each other. And so we think they're really the same kind of thing. Well, what does that mean? That means coyotes and wolves have a common ancestry. And what about foxes? Well, they're canines. And if all canines are part of God's original kind creation, in other words, the original design for a canine, then that means coyotes and wolves and domesticated dogs and foxes all share a common ancestor. And so that's common descent. You started with one, a couple, maybe hundreds. There's disputes among young earth creationists about like how many individuals were at the beginning of each kind. But nonetheless, there's a lot of common ancestry involved in this process, especially since you had Noah's Ark. There was only 2 canines, right, on Noah's Ark. And if those 2 represent foxes, wolves, coyotes, and so forth, then that's where their common ancestor is on the ark. And then eventually you go back farther to creation, there'd be another common ancestor, which would be the original common design. Now, do you see where it's like, okay, now I'm going to go back to my challenge to common design. Like identifying, how do you know whether something is common design or whether you're looking at something that has common ancestry? So you look at a coyote and a wolf and you say, that's common design, right? The reason they share so many characteristics is because of common design. God created them with those particular designs. And the reason they share all these different genes and they have these particular genes in a particular order that's similar between coyotes and wolves, but different than foxes, is not because they share a recent common ancestor that had that particular sequence of genes, or worse yet, has these broken genes that only wolves and coyotes have, or endogenous retroviruses that only dogs and wolves and coyotes share. And the common ancestry explanation is, well, that's because they obtain those characteristics, those genomic characteristics in the common ancestor. That common ancestor then shared them through descent with their descendants. That's why they share those characteristics. The common design argument would be they don't share those ERVs, endogenous retroviruses, in the exact same positions because of common descent. They share them because God designed them to be in those particular locations that are the same between wolves and coyotes, because he wanted to make 2 organisms that looked kind of similar to each other and kind of acted similar to each other, and somehow those spots are important for that, right? Or just out of a whim, right? That there's no functional reason for it. I mean, many creationists try to say there's function to all ERVs, but why say that? God simply could create something with no function, right? And he could create 2 things that have a bunch of stuff that's non-functional in exactly the same location just to do it. And you could, and we would come late, you could come along later and say, look, those 2 things look identical to each other in those 2 different organisms, but we know they're not related to each other by common descent because common descent's wrong, and therefore it's common design. Yeah. All right. But I don't see creationists, I don't see intelligent designists, not many, arguing that coyotes and wolves have similarities, have patterns of similarities because of common design. I see them saying that they have patterns of similarities because of common descent. So that's where I'm saying that in this case, they're convinced by the preponderance of evidence that they share a common ancestor, because all these traits that they share in common make most sense if they got them from a common ancestor. And to argue for common design kind of sounds very, well, I guess I've been using the word ad hoc. It just, it kind of comes out of nowhere. There isn't any, like, this doesn't sound, like I can't think of a reason why these two things would share all these characteristics, except for God just made it that way. But when you start talking about characteristics that don't appear to serve any function, but have, and so therefore don't seem to have any purpose, the common descent argument can easily explain characteristics with no function, no purpose, especially characteristics that are broken in organisms. So they once had a function, but now they no longer do. And multiple organisms share that non-functional piece of DNA. That's easy to explain from a common descent point of view. From a common design perspective, it's much more difficult to make it sound like that's more plausible than the common descent argument. So I can't, like I was saying before, I can't prove the common descent. All I can say is that the common descent makes sense. It's intuitively, it feels intuitive, and it fits the data really, really well. It explains so many different kinds of patterns that otherwise would be kind of like, they would be head scratchers. It'd be like, why does this organism have this and this one has, why do whales have hundreds of genes for smelling products that are in the air when they don't need those products? Why do whales have a sugar taste gene when they're not going to taste their food? Right? Why do whales have abundance of genetic features and DNA genes that are related to cows and other bovines, that those bovines are using for functional reasons on land, but they don't have them in the ocean? They don't need those genes. Why wouldn't a common designer simply design the organism without those things? See, common descent makes total sense for whales. It explains the data very easily, because it's like, well, whales once lived on land. They came from a land animal. And so therefore they had all the genetics of a land animal. And as they moved into the sea, they no longer needed those. And so they started to break and fall apart, and they stopped using those things. But they still have them in their genome, many of those in their genome. And that is intuitive, makes sense, and it helps explain the observations we make of the real world. The common design argument is kind of like, God started, I guess you have to say, God started, he wanted to make whales, some animal that is mammal-like, because it has the mammal body plan, really, the mammal operating system. So he's like, I got to have a mammal operating system, and I'm going to make a mammal for the ocean. So I'm going to start with a cow. Rather than just make a mammal operating system and then just say, like, here, I'm going to add these features and that's going to be a cetacean, a whale. He said, let's start with a cow. And that'll be my basic operating system, cow or other ungulate. And then I'm going to add a bunch of characteristics. I'm going to add some genes and adapt some other genes and change some genes so that it can live in the ocean. But there's all these other genes that I started with that made a land animal that it doesn't need anymore, but I'm just going to copy them over and allow this mammal that's living in the sea to have all those genes that they're not going to use. Why not scrap them? Why doesn't it, that's not intelligent design, right? That if you were designing, it's not the way you would design it, right? And surely God's a better designer than we are, but it's hard for us to rationalize why those characters would exist when they don't need to. And so it's I guess when it comes down to it, you have to say the simplest explanation is that the common ancestry or common descent argument fits the data the best and the simplest. And so I'm not going to say that one piece of data proves common descent. It's very strong evidence for common descent for whales. And you add it to 100 other pieces of data I could give you that also show the same pattern. Then you end up with this overwhelming sense that this animal was a land animal at some point. But I can't exclude I can't exclude the common design argument because you literally can't completely prove that it's wrong, right? But at the very least, if you want to argue common design, you shouldn't argue that common ancestry doesn't make sense. I mean, and many times you're going to have to, you should admit the common ancestry argument makes complete sense. And it explains the data in the observations we make in the world around us. But you prefer the common design argument. And I go back to the dog thing, right? Because I would say, anyone who doesn't know anything about dogs, and let's say you didn't know that they could breed with each other or whatever, you just said, well, here's this animal and here's this animal. Where did they come from? And you're just like, well, God made all these different organisms, so that's common design. You could argue for that common design. And no matter what evidence I brought to you, I could say, here are these genes, here are these pseudogenes, here are these endogenous retroviruses, here are these morphological features, here's all these things that these two share. They even have these fossils that look similar to each other and look like they have a more similar relative in the past, right? So I can show you evidence from a lot of different directions. And yet at the end of the day, any common designist could just keep saying, that's common design, right? God created them so they look very similar because he created them with the same design pattern with just some slight differences between them. You'll never, ever, ever be able to prove the common ancestry, right? Likewise, the person trying to prove common design is not going to be able to prove common design either. All right, so let's see. Where was I going to go with this? Oh, yeah, I was going to push that a little farther. I was going to say, all right, so young earth creationists and others, and a lot of intelligent designists and progressive creationists, they may be willing to say something like all canines are the same kind. So they do share a common ancestor, and that common ancestor was on the ark and then eventually back in creation. All right, so, but that common ancestor, so that's I'll say that's a lot of common ancestry. You're accepting a lot of common descent if you do that. Here's where I should have gone first before I went into the spiel I just went into. What if I said, what about bears and dogs? And that's right where most creationists put up some walls, right? They're like, bears, they're a little more different than dogs. And that has to be common design. Because once again, we could show skeletal features, we could show DNA features, we could show how bears and dogs are far more similar to each other in terms of their genome and the structure of the genome and how it operates and how they control their genes and all kinds of stuff. We could show fossils that show they're more similar to each other over time, back to a common ancestor or what looks like a common ancestor compared to, say, cats. All right, they're more similar to the cats. Why do we see that pattern? Why are dogs and bears similar to each other relative to cats? The common design argument is, well, God started with one or the other and made the other one and then tweaked it even more. Like maybe he started with a basic kind of carnivore operating system and then made dogs, he made bears, and then after he made bears, he made dogs, right, or canines. And because he was making them in his mind around the same time, they have a lot of similar features to each other. And they're going to live in similar habitats or something like that. And so they need similar features. And that's why they share those characteristics. And then he kind of set those aside and he's like, let's go back to the original carnivore operating system and let's add in some other different features and I'll make cats. All right. And then I'll make hyenas and they're really similar to cats. Okay. And so forth. And so that's the common design sort of feel to that. But if you didn't really know that much about biology, You could take the tactic of, well, God just made an original carnivore and then allowed it to vary. All right. Because everybody already accepts common ancestry, right? Everyone accepts some common ancestry. I share common ancestry with you out there. So everybody accepts common ancestry. And you just have to keep pushing yourself back. Like, at what point do I not have common ancestry? Now, of course, the original question that was at the beginning here asked the follow-up question, which is a really important question, which was specifically about Adam and Eve. All right, so you find Adam and Eve. Well, then what about the ancestry of Adam and Eve? Is there common descent from something else to Adam and Eve? Right. Now, that's the question that I think most Christians and others are really interested and intrigued in thinking about. I'm trying to keep this a little more general, just to think about common descent overall, which then allows you to have some perspective on, like, okay, now if I'm going to think about Adam and Eve, I have to think about what kind of evidence am I going to use for common descent versus common design? And how would that differ? Like, how would I recognize the differences? Like, how would I know that in this case, this is common design, but over here, this is common descent? And that's kind of what I'm getting at is it can be very difficult if you want to have your cake and eat it too, right? You want to have common ancestry because you know it exists, but you also want to have common design because you don't want to have universal common ancestry. And so you're trying to find that fracture point where you look at two things and you go, like, everything I see there is common design. Oh, but the descendants of these, all the features I see there in common, that's common ancestry and not common design at all. And there doesn't seem to be a whole lot of mixing between the two. It's like either the organism is completely natural, like God finished making this thing by design and there was no ancestry involved at all, right? Other than potentially some kind of common ancestry in his development of making the organisms. But from our perspective, they appear, right? There's the organisms. They do not have ancestors. And then from there, they don't have any more design, right? The design's there, and then the design gets tweaked by natural processes, natural selection, genetic drift, mutations, all the things that are part of descent by modification, because now they're descending, right? They're having descendants. And those descendants then are subject to the world around them, the environment, natural selection, right? Working on different variations they have to sculpt them to different environments. So, let me think back here for a second. I might have gotten myself a little off track. We're talking about bears and wolves. Oh, yeah, we're talking about human beings. And I was saying, what I'm trying to direct you toward is helping you think through this, working backwards from obvious cases of common ancestry, and then asking yourself, how do you know when you've reached the moment where you've gone from common ancestry to common design? Like, how do you know when that step is taken? And as I've indicated, that is a very challenging question that young Earth creationists are very much grappling with. And to reiterate something I said before, if you looked at something like coyotes and wolves, I'll say that no human being has been an eyewitness to the origin of wolves and coyotes, right? There's no direct visual evidence, right, like eyewitness evidence. And that eyewitness evidence includes, there's no biblical evidence which tells us that coyotes and wolves absolutely share a common ancestor by common descent. And so when you look at those two, how are you going to decide? Common ancestry, common descent. And I'll say that the vast majority of people, Christians, who are anti-evolutionist, are still going to conclude common descent, not common design. Even though they're going to apply the same rubric, essentially, the same pieces of evidence. Similar genomes, similar patterns in where genes are placed in the genome, total amount of percentage similarities, similar body plans, right? Behavioral things that are common between the two. All these things add up to kind of this gestalt of these two things are related to each other. All right, they share ancestry with one another. And then, but somewhere you have to find out where your break point is. If you don't want to track things all the way back to universal common ancestry, you got to find that break point. Like, where does it slip into common design versus common ancestry? And how are you weighing the data? It's like all of a sudden at some point, all this other data that had convinced you of common descent, you no longer believe that's common descent. And now you say, I believe this is common design. I think just to say, I'm not naive about what I think is the answer to that question. That is, I think Christian will say, what I do is I say that if I can identify from the Bible the ultimate authority here that a particular group of animals seems to be a kind. Now, that's a hard thing to define. Even the Bible doesn't write out, come and say, these 7 different species are the same kind. But if you can come to some reasonable guesstimate that these are a kind, then you could say to yourself, I'm fine with them having common ancestry. I accept all the data that suggests the reasons they have similarities is because of common ancestry. And then if you look at another group of organisms that you believe is outside that kind, that's where you'd say, I see the same data. I see all these pieces of evidence that before I was totally happy accepting as common ancestry. But I have to believe that they are not related, right? Because of my convictions about how I'm interpreting the first chapters of Genesis. And because of that, I am now committed to interpreting that same evidence as common design. Yeah, I was going to talk about whales a whole bunch more, had some pictures, but you know what? I think I'm going to go to my last point because I've been rambling on for a long time. And maybe I'll cut out the genetic code stuff. We'll see. I'm going to push this just a little bit further, and I'm going to push this to the absurd end, all right? Sometimes it helps to just push the idea out to where it gets just too crazy, but I think it makes a point. Right? Maybe there's no common ancestry at all. Right? Wouldn't it be great? Wouldn't a great answer, a way to decide common descent, common ancestry, is if there was no common ancestry at all? Everything is common design. You know, in some way, I'm a believer in that, in the sense that I believe that everything is designed, that the whole world and everything in the world is God's design. But at the same time, I believe that common ancestry is a mechanism for how that design is explored and exhibited in biological diversity. But I could see the flip side. I could see where somebody might say, you know what? There's only design. And by design, I mean there's no ancestry at all. Right? You can't have both. I'm saying there's kind of both at the same time. But some might say there's no ancestry at all. Right? Maybe our parents were simply used as the templates for making us. Like that, our parents are the common design template God used. And then he said, okay, I'm going to make these offspring. But the making of that offspring is not by common descent. It may be miraculous, right? There's a sperm and an egg, and maybe we could see that. We could see like there's these genomes, but God could say, here are these genomes I'm being presented with, right? And then they're going to come together in one cell, but I'm not actually going to, there's no natural mechanism. In fact, somebody could say this. Somebody could argue, that is such a complex process. The chances of that working, of you taking billions of base pairs and 2 different separate genomes and then bringing them together and then having them work out, like you're going to use moms for this, dads for this, and all the different things that have to happen for those genomes to collaborate with each other and make an actual like workable human being, that might be so inconceivable to you that you might say, you could just argue, but that doesn't actually happen. It's not natural. It has to be God doing that. And that's where God is intervening in every generation. Every generation, God is taking the template, right? And then he is putting it together. After all, each one of us has about 100 new differences that our parents don't have. Where did those come from? God added those. Those are the added elements. That's what makes us different than our parents. And so we are each designed. How about that? Now, this is going to fly in the face of almost all Christians who are going to say, God doesn't actually create anymore. He's done with creation. Everything else is natural. But I will say that that doesn't really work when you really even push that idea out very far. For one thing, you get into the whole argument about souls, and does God create souls now, or are they sort of like a whole soul reserve all the way from the beginning, and he's simply placing the soul in with the body? And so there's the whole transduction versus creation debate and that. And you can get into all the arguments about how active God is in the world in terms of producing miracles today. Is he only using and guiding natural processes, or is he miraculously doing things and changing things in a moment? Because if he is, you could make the argument that no organism that comes into existence, no individual, is actually the result of common ancestry, but goes through a phase in which they're all redesigned every single generation. And I dare you to prove me wrong. Like, prove me wrong. Prove that that doesn't happen. You're going to have a tough time. And that's the thing about the common design argument, is like, it's virtually impossible to prove wrong. You can always just say, well, that's what God did, or you can't explain this. As long as you can't explain something, and I guarantee there's going to be something I can't explain about the process of reproduction, right? And there's going to be something that nobody on this earth can explain. And if you look at that and you say, you can't explain that, therefore God, that's design. That's where I'm seeing God's interaction and design. Then really I can't prove it otherwise, right? I'll never convince you. Now, I said that this was absurd. I think this is ridiculous. I don't think anyone really believes that every single individual is designed. But let me tell you, if you say they're not designed, then please at least admit that common descent happens, right? That's your proof that common descent happens. I've actually, in a more, I'm not going to say philosophical way, but as a style of proof, I've kind of proven that common descent happens. Because if no one accepts my other absurd thing, the alternative is there's common descent. So there's common descent between myself, my sister, my parents, and as I said, between my cousins, third cousins, 10th cousins, 100th cousins. I can keep going back and I can find common ancestors, right? And we're going to call that common descent. And there's been some modification along the way. None of us are absolutely identical. As I said, we all have 100 unique mutations, unique points in our DNA that are not present in our parents. So there are new things that arise along the way. And so as you travel back in time, you're going to continue to find common ancestors, common ancestors, common ancestors, common ancestors. And so what I'm here to say is, I think thinking about the animal kingdom or plants or whatever your favorite organism is, you need to ask yourselves, how am I going to, what evidence am I actually using for common descent? Because I think you see just from the way I've presented this, that we just take it for granted. But if you really start thinking through what is the evidence for it, well, there's an eyewitness account of me being born and so forth. So that's all right. But if you start asking, what's the evidence that I have my 100th cousin, we have a common ancestor, and your ancestry is lost, what's it going to be? I have faith in that. Now, you would point to a whole bunch of things about your DNA, about your I have common features with other human beings, right? That other person is also a human being, and I can see we have a common anatomy. You know what? You'd have a raft of characteristics that you would go to and you'd say, like, because of all these things, I probably share a common ancestor. So really at the end, I'm going to say that this is one of the most powerful evidences of common ancestry. is the fact that we intuit it, right? It is intuitive that we share common ancestors. And we do this process all the time in which we feel like organisms are related to each other because of those common shared characteristics. And it's not until we not until some Christians bump up into, knotty problems, right? Well, if I accept that these share our relatives, then that raises the specter of evolution, a form of evolution that I don't want to accept, even though you accept some forms of evolution, everybody does. But especially with Adam and Eve, right? That's where the rubber is going to meet the road, is in that question of, all right, I can see that I can just keep going back. And is there an Adam and an Eve? Is there a pair of individuals? Is there a group of individuals that represents the common ancestry? What about Neanderthals? How do they fit in? Get into all those different questions. I've already rambled way too long. I'm going to use that as an excuse for not talking about that right now. But this is sort of setting the framework for being able to discuss that really important question. Yeah, I had a lot of other things I thought of, and I've got a checklist over here of things I could talk about. But in a way, I don't feel like I need to go through like a whole bunch of specific examples. We don't need to talk about ERVs. I know that everyone loves talking about endogenous retroviruses, and anti-evolutionists, are just all about talking about ERVs and trying to come up with explanations for how they don't count as common descent, evidence of common descent or common ancestry. And as I said before, I think all of that is a little bit of a moot point. I actually think those evidences are quite good, but you get bogged down into the molecular details. And as you saw earlier, if I don't cut that part out, when we're talking about the genetic code, it becomes very easy to get lost and not see the trees in the forest, okay? And so I really think it kind of helps, and this has been a helpful exercise to me, to kind of step back and just think about, what does ancestry mean? How do we identify ancestry in the most simple sense? And then just have ourselves think through, like, how would I find that point where ancestry is the best explanation, but then somehow the scales are tipped toward design as a better explanation in some other circumstances. So everyone has to ask themselves, as they look at a set of observations in the world around us, what best fits that particular data? And I'm here to also tell you that from my perspective, right, as a Christian, choosing one over the other, or saying like, oh, this is common ancestry, that to me doesn't deny God's existence or presence or part in the creation. And I think that's the fear that many people have, is like, okay, I don't want to give up on, I want to keep common design, and I want to say God designed this, and that somehow that excludes God from being able to design through ancestry, design through descent with modification. And yet, he obviously does, right? At least in some limited temporal sense, for thousands of years, God has been designing, adapting, and working in his world through the mechanism of common descent. I don't really know how to end this. Thanks for the question. And I hope my meanderings make some sense and maybe give you some new ways to think about this. It's kind of given me some new ways to think about just having gone through this. As I said, it's kind of like off the top of my head, and I'm just kind of like going and seeing where my mind goes. And that's the beauty of these types of things, is that as you explore ideas and you're kind of forced to answer questions, which is why I love questions, why I ask students questions, is like, it makes you think about what you know and what you don't know, and forces you to confront issues from different ways than maybe you've just been told you should believe about them. So I guess I should say, at a minimum, if this was at all interesting to you, subscribe to my channel, and I'm sure I'll have some meandering talks off the top of my head about many other things in the future. So thanks for listening. Subscribe. I'll be back with a This Week in Creationism at some point. And hit me up with some interesting questions, and maybe I'll take one of them up in the mailbag episode number 4. Thanks a lot. Have a great day. Bye-bye.